Welcome to all of you here again, and welcome to people around the world who may be joining us on Facebook Live. I'm Harriet Bograd, president of Kulanu, and we're so glad you're with us. Kulanu supports isolated, emerging, and returning Jewish communities around the world, and we've been doing this for 26 years now. And we have with us some of Kulanu's founders, Jack Zeller and Aaron and Karen Primack, among others. You know, the rest of you know who you are. And we're going to show a very short video in 1.5 minutes about Kulanu's work.
Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Oh, Davinu Chai, oh,
We've been having a speaker series with 2 speakers a month since March, and except for one program where the speaker didn't want it to be public, all our programs have been posted online. Molly will put that in the chat. The link for those programs is kulanu.org/recorded sessions with a dash between recorded and sessions, all lowercase. And you're welcome, if you missed any, to see the any of the past programs. We want to thank our sponsors. Molly's going to post the list. Who include Ruth Errol Carr, Margie Katz, Janet Lipsey, Len and Maxine Lyons, Karen and Aaron Primack, Richard and Lise Rosenfield, Rabbi Gerald and Benita Nathan Sussman, Frida Rosenfeld and Howard Wallach, and David Weiser. Thank you for your support. And anyone else who wants to support, in addition, you know, is still welcome to do so. We're going to have a short poll, a very quick poll for you to tell us how you learned about this event. And then I'm happy to introduce Benita Nathan Sussman, who will be introducing our speaker and also being part of the presentation later. Benita Nathan Sussman is first vice president of Kulanu, and since she got involved in 2007, Kulanu has expanded enormously, partly because we used to only take on new communities when we thought we had the resources to do so. But since Bonnie's come on, she said, any community that comes to us, I'll take them on. So she's been going all over the world with her husband, visiting new communities, or she's been communicating with them from home. But the fact that we have 33 communities on our map now that we're in touch with is in large part because of Bonnie. She was the person who said, we need to have a formal relationship with the academic scholars who are working in this field, and she came up with the idea of the Kulanu academic cohort, which has approximately 10 scholars interested in communities like the ones we work with. And of course, Professor Tudor Parfitt is the dean of that scholarly world. And so now I give you Bonnie to continue the introduction.
Okay, thank you, Harriet. Are the speakers' faces changing? Are we like being, okay. Professor Parfitt is a British historian, writer, broadcaster, traveler, and adventurer, having appeared on the History Channel, BBC, PBS, in many documentaries on the study of lost tribes and Jewish communities around the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. He is the founder of the academic study of Judaizing groups in Africa and is widely introduced as the British Indiana Jones. He actually has a hat like Indy. Currently, he is the Distinguished University Professor at Florida International University and director and founder of the Global Jewish Program there that hosts many Jewish programs at the Jewish Museum in Miami Beach. Professor Parfitt is Emeritus Professor of Modern Jewish Studies in the University of London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, where he was the founding director of the Center for Jewish Studies. He is the Senior Associate Fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies and serves as corresponding Senior Fellow of the Académie Royale des Sciences. I think I pronounced that okay. He is the board chair of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Paris-based Project Aladdin, whose goal is to promote mutual understanding between Jews and Muslims. In that capacity, he has brought Muslim state leaders and high-ranking Muslim clerics to visit Auschwitz. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in the UK. He is alumni fellow at the Hutchins Center, Harvard College. He has authored 30 books, the most recent Hybrid Hate, of which we will be discussing in this interview, and hundreds of articles. The professor that I have gotten to know over the last 6 years has taught hundreds of non-Jews and Jews how to read Hebrew, about Jewish history and culture. He has translated Hebrew poetry into English and advocated to Israeli government officials and Knesset about lost tribes and the importance of emerging Jewish communities. He has been an influence on the way I understand the work that I do for Kulanu and the implications for the future of Judaism. While being an Anglican himself, he has taken pro-Israel stances to audiences that have heckled him. I once said to him, "You took punches for us?" He responded, "Benita, I am not feeling particularly saintly now." With humbleness and pride, I introduce to you the Dr. Tudor Parfitt. We can't, Tudor, Professor, we can't hear you.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Bonnie. It's been great knowing you over the last many, many years. We've done a lot of things together. We've traveled the world in Papua New Guinea and Nicaragua and elsewhere. And it's always been wonderful being associated with you and your husband. I'm very fond of him, as you know, and with Kulanu in general. So it's been a great ride in many respects, and it goes back about 30 years. I think my first contact with Kulanu. So.
Okay. So we set up a bunch of questions. So this will be an interview style. And the first question, Professor, what prompted you to take on Jewish studies as your academic pursuit?
Well, I was very lucky, really, because when I was a kid of 18, I was sent through an organization called Voluntary Service Overseas to Jerusalem. And for a year, I worked with handicapped people in a place called Akvarasvedi, the Swedish village, just outside Jerusalem. And during that period, I learned a little bit of Hebrew, a little bit of Yiddish. I got absolutely fascinated in the whole business of Israel, certainly, but Jewish communities as well. And I had a great friend called Lola Zinger, who was the social worker in the Kfar Shvedi. And once a week, we would go to some place in Israel, some remote moshav or village or something like that, and meet the parents of one of the kids in the institution. And so by the end of the year, I'd met Jews from really literally all over the world, from Bukhara or from Kurdistan or from the States, obviously, from the Yemen, everything. So when I went back at the end of this year, I was going to Oxford and I started off reading history, but after a bit I thought, no, my heart is not really in kind of English history or anything like that. I want to do Hebrew. So I did Hebrew and Arabic for my first degree. And then I got a fellowship at the Hebrew University after that. And then I went back to Oxford and did my PhD on the Jewish community in Palestine. And that really was then the beginning of my academic career. That's the answer.
Okay. How did you become interested in Jews of color issues?
Well, my training was mainly in European Jewish history, I suppose. And I was interested in anti-Semitism, certainly. I was certainly interested in the history of the Jews in the Middle East as well. And that was my doctoral thesis. And it was really very much by chance in 1976, somebody called David Kessler, the name is going to be known to some of you, I think, because he wrote a very good book on the Ethiopian Jews. And he was the chairman of the Jewish Chronicle in London, one of the great Jewish newspapers. And he invited me to his club, the Athenaeum, very grand club. And we had lunch. And during the lunch, he said, Tudor, I think it would be very good if you went to the Sudan because the Ethiopian Jews are being poisoned. And I said, okay. And so a couple of days later, on behalf of the minority rights group, of which David was a member and a trustee, I went to Khartoum, took a bus to the eastern part of the Sudan on the border with Ethiopia. And while I was there, I realized that an incredible operation was starting. I heard Hebrew being spoken in the alleys between the huts in the refugee camp where I'd been directed. And this was Operation Moses. So I eventually got back after a lot of adventures, and that sort of launched me in the business of Black Jews, because I wrote a book called Operation Moses, and then a matter of weeks later, I was invited to go and give a lecture about the Ethiopian Jews in Johannesburg. And while I was in Johannesburg, I met some Lemba men who'd come to the lecture. And the other people in the lecture hall were, they were mainly white South African Jews. And it was a very prosperous, quite intellectual group. And at the back, standing up, were half a dozen quite poorly dressed black men wearing yarmulkes. And so at the end of the lecture, I kind of tottered over to where these men were standing, and I said, well, who are you? And they said, well, we're the same as the Ethiopian Jews, we're Jews. And I think that I must have looked pretty dubious about this. And they said, no, 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 really, believe me, believe it. You have to believe. And if you just come to our villages, you'll soon see that we are telling the truth and that we really genuinely are a lost Jewish tribe. So that weekend, I did go with them to their villages in what was then called Venderland. And I was sort of convinced that there was some Semitic background to the stories. It was incredibly interesting, fascinating things they had to say. And when I got back to London, I went to see Lord Whitenfeld, who was my publisher. And it was he who published the book that has already been mentioned. It was my first travel book, The 13th Gate, long time ago. And I told him the story. He was absolutely taken by it. And he said, get leave from SOAS, go back, I'll give you a good advance and do what you want to do. And what I wanted to do was to go on a journey which followed the oral tradition of the Lemba across Africa, because their story had it that they came from a place called Senna. They weren't at all sure where this was. And it seemed to me, wrong map, that this was a journey worth doing. If you just go on to Tudor Parfitt, Extraordinary Journey, there's a map of it on the internet, which was put up some years ago by the PBS in New York. So that's how I kind of got into the business of Black Jews. First the Ethiopian Jews, that led me to the Lemba in South Africa, and then I kind of took a break, wrote a book about the Yemenite Jews, and I did various other things, a book on the lost tribes of Israel and the way that that was mythologized and became part of a sort of colonial mytheme, if you like. And then finally I wrote a book which was pulling everything somewhat together, and that was published back in 2012 or 13, and that was called The Black Jews of Africa and the Americas, and that was published by Harvard University Press. And I suppose at that point I really thought this was it. You know, I didn't really have anything else to give to this topic. And it was with some irritation about 3 years later that I came across a Jewish community in Africa which I didn't know about and which I hadn't mentioned in my book.
Should we, wait, Professor, should we go in order of our questions and get to that one later?
If you like.
Because I don't want to steal your thunder, okay?
No, you go with it.
Okay, so I also know that one of the books you wrote about the opening essay, the one that was published in 2013, really changed my view. The opening essay is What Color Are the Jews? And it was a study of Jewish sources, Christian sources, and Islamic sources on the discussion of what color Jews are. So you are one of the founders of the Academic Studies of Jews in Africa and Lost Tribes, and have traveled extensively to far away and sometimes dangerous places for your studies. I know you've contracted dengue fever and other traveling diseases. We met on our travels to Papua New Guinea. Would you like to talk about some of your travels to places where most people don't want to visit?
Well, Papua New Guinea was a very interesting thing. I was invited quite a few years ago by by Sydney University to go and give a lecture. And the real reason for wanting to go to Sydney in the first place was because my son was there and I wanted to see my son. So I accepted this invitation to Australia, which I'd never visited before. And I was staying in this hotel in Sydney, and one day I got a telephone call to the hotel, and it was from somebody in Papua New Guinea. And so he said that he was the leader of the Jewish community in Papua New Guinea, and he'd read about my stuff on the internet, and he'd understood that, you know, I'd managed to prove through genetic means that the Lemba in South Africa, this black Jewish tribe, or this black tribe that claimed to be Jewish, and somehow managed to prove this through genetic study. And he wanted me to do the same thing for his tribe in Papua New Guinea. Well, it seemed to me to be entirely improbable that Jews ever historically got to Papua New Guinea. But the idea that there was somebody from a group which had been cannibalistic until shortly before the Second World War should be asking the question about lost tribes and Jews and genetics was deeply fascinating. So I said, well, yeah, I mean, it could be interesting. And so a couple of days later, I was called down to the lobby of the hotel, and this gentleman turned up from Papua New Guinea. And he came up to my room and he had a hat with him. And he proffered the hat and said, I've got something very important in this hat. And he'd got 100 or so strands of hair, which he'd taken from from members of his tribe. And so what he wanted me to do, which in fact was theoretically feasible, was to take the hair back and have the DNA extracted from each strand of hair. But in fact, it wasn't able to work that way. And so I had to, if I was going to do it, I had to go back to Papua New Guinea. And I went back and listened to the stories and the tales that they had, which associated them in some way with the people of Israel. And eventually they were getting deeper and deeper into their desire to be Jewish or to study Judaism. And so I thought it would be a great idea to take the Sussmans on a trip which I organized, I guess it was in 2013. So a group of students from FIU and the Sussmans went to Papua New Guinea, and I guess the idea was essentially to instruct them in Hebraic matters, and Rabbi Sussman played a very leading role in this, and they really wanted confirmation as a group that the DNA studies that we'd done proved their claim to be Jewish, which it didn't. And of course, on a previous trip, I went quite a number of times. I'd found myself on a small island surrounded by 500 or 600 heavily armed tribesmen who were desperate to learn from me that DNA had proved that they were Jewish. And so I had to be a little bit, well, I suppose, circumspect about the answer that I gave, which I suppose you could call mealy-mouthed, but it wasn't certainly a direct refutation of their hopes and aspirations. In my mind, it doesn't really matter. I don't think DNA makes any difference about anything, really. It might prove some historical movement back in remote history. It could conceivably do that, but it certainly doesn't make anybody Jewish or make any group Jewish. Judaism is not a strand of DNA or anything like it. So still, it has been a very interesting ride, the genetic ride.
Okay, so now let's talk about your new book, Hybrid Hate, that can be bought on Amazon. I think we're putting up a link to it. There'll be a coupon attached to it. It's published by Oxford, and I think it's coming out November 6th. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, I rather prematurely, and I'm sorry about that, moved to the question of my frustration and fury when I discovered that there was a Jewish community in Africa that I hadn't written about. And this came about really rather by chance, as I was reading a book that had been written, or rather published, in 1777 by a German missionary who had gone to the what we call the West Indies, the Caribbean, to study a particular German missionary group there, which had a number of slaves. And he had interviewed these slaves, and one of the slaves told him the following tale, that according to a slave who had come from Loango, which now we could have that map up, it's on the west coast of Africa, and it was an independent African kingdom until the end of the 19th century. Quite a well-organized place. You can see it up here. And so he said that in Loango there was a group of black Jews, and they didn't eat with the Negroes. I'm just using the best translation of the German Neger in the context of the time. And that they didn't speak on the Sabbath. They didn't talk to the Negroes. They themselves were Negroes. They looked exactly the same as everybody else, and they had a separate cemetery. And on the gravestones, which were prepared before a body was inserted into them by a particular stone mason who would come and do it, there were painted probably images of snakes and lizards. So it was a really very, very surprising thing to read, and it was difficult to imagine what the role of these snakes and lizards were, and how the slave in question knew about this particular community. And sort of looking around at the usual sources in, Jewish history or African history, African studies, books about Loango, anything that you could think might be relevant to a really odd Jewish community, there was nothing. And if you look today, you will not really find anything at all. But, and that's the beginning of this new book, the one that's coming out, I think actually towards the end of October. What I did discover was that it became a really hot topic among Enlightenment thinkers by the end of the 18th century. Okay, it's published in 1777. Immediately the following year, there's a big discussion of the importance of this from a racial point of view, from a biological point of view, and it spread. And so soon, Enlightenment racial scholars, biologists, geographers, all kinds of people involved in the German Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, and the British Enlightenment, they were fascinated by the idea that that Jews could be black. Okay. Now, why were they so fascinated? Their fascination actually rather mirrored my own fascination. So I felt a personal involvement in this. I couldn't really understand, for instance, why, you know, me and my colleagues had been laboring in the groves of academe for years when I wrote my first book about the Ethiopian Jew. You know, it wasn't my first book, it was a book about the Ethiopian Jews. And all of a sudden, you know, my stuff was on the front pages of all the newspapers in the world, pretty much. It had fantastic publicity. And similarly, when I did my first book on the Lemba, I finished up on 60 minutes. And, you know, it was on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, all over the place. Fantastic, incredible publicity. Why? Why is it, I thought, that Black Jews are so deeply troubling to somehow to Western sensibilities? It really puzzled me for a long time. And it was interesting, it was fascinating to see that Enlightenment scholars at the end of the 18th century were equally puzzled. And the reason that they were puzzled, why were they puzzled? They were puzzled because they didn't know how they became Black. And they thought that maybe it was a question of climate. And there were lots of people who would come out and say, yeah, if you take an Englishman and you plant him in Central Africa, leave him there for 10, 15, 20 years, he'll turn Black. So this would be the explanation. And so this was a proof, if you like, this was a great proof that climate is the thing that determines race. And this fed into a much wider debate, which Bonnie, I think, can introduce.
I think this leads us to the discussion of the difference. In the book, you use the phrase monogenism and polygenism. Is this the question you're looking for, Dr. Parfitt?
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
Please explain what they mean and how they shed light on today's issues of race relations.
Well, in the same way that over the last 6 months, you know, despite everything else that is going on in the world, we have been riven with an international debate about race, which one might think to be unprecedented, but it's not. Because from the last couple of decades, probably of the 18th century, right through until the Second World War, there was an ongoing debate which was absolutely at the heart of intellectual interest throughout Europe and the United States and other Western countries about the origins of mankind. And so the two main arguments went like this pretty much, that either the Judeo-Christian Muslim idea of Adam and Eve was true, in which case we're all one human family, or, and this is called monogenism. Monogenism means that, you know, there was one father and one mother of mankind and we are ultimately all the same, or that there were different founder events in different parts of the world, and the different races were the product of quite different ancient ancestors, and that the races concerned could not possibly, under any circumstances, change. Races were immutable, both in terms of their physical, biological properties, but also in terms of their spiritual or intellectual capacities. The racial age, according to me, and I've, you know, the book I've been thinking about writing is not quite the book that I'm writing at the moment. The next book, or the book after that, will be looking at the racial age from a certain point of view, and I could talk about that if you'd like me to now. But do stop me if you think it's going off on a tangent. The racial age really starts at the end of the 17th century with the work of a particular French medical man called Francois Bernier. And he was the first person to suggest that the world was divided into races. Nobody thought in those terms before Francois Bernier at all. And it seems very, very odd. There's always a great discussion, let's say, among American historians about, you know, what comes first in America? Is it race or is it slavery? And the truth is that when slavery started, nobody was thinking in terms of race. So it could be that, that slavery, in a way, developed into racial prejudice. Or it could be that sort of pre-racial prejudice, which is a kind of generalized prejudice on the basis of the metaphor of black, had some impact upon people and their treatment of African slaves when they got to the Americas. But it's a big kind of intellectual discussion. And so the racial age anyway starts around the end of the 17th century. It was developed through the 18th century. All of the kind of different gradations of race and the pyramids of race were developed in the second half of the 18th century. And then really became standard thinking by the middle of the 19th century. And the people doing all of this kind of racial structuring, they were all polygenists, because they all felt that race was the most incredibly important thing in the world. It was more important than religion. It was more important than history. It was more important than politics. It really was all of those things. And it wasn't that these people were particularly, you know, bad or nasty people. It was what some of them were, by the way, but it was really what they believed. And on the other hand, you had the monogenists who believed, no, everybody's essentially the same. Some are more developed for historical, economic reasons and so on. But underneath the skin, we're all the same people. We all go back to Adam and Eve. And so why then, all of a sudden, do the people that we're all interested in this group, everybody here is interested in the question of Jews, as we say, of color throughout the world. I mean, that's one of these are the groups, Kulanu and me, you know, we've been very interested in. And they've been marginal. They're still very, very marginal. They're very, very marginal in terms of, let's say, Jewish historians, in terms of the state of Israel, in terms of what people are thinking about in the kind of general, you know, Jewish journals in the United States and newspapers, occasionally an article here, an article there. It's marginal stuff. However, at the end of the 18th century and for the first half of the 19th century, Jews of color were not marginal. They were mainstream preoccupations of people. That's something which I'm the first person to point out. It was interesting for racial theorists for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that you've got, for the first time, the idea that Jews are multicolored, right? And so that in itself is kind of interesting, but the underlying thing is the proof that this provides to the monogenists. And they took up the cause of all of the black, brown, Jewish communities throughout the world, like, you know, like it was the most fabulous, fabulous thing that they could imagine in support of their own ideas. And they would spend their times traveling the world and looking for new black Jewish communities, and they could bring these back and feed them into the racial kind of machine. And it was simply this, that if Jews can change racial look, if they can change face, if they can change color, as they did in the case of, apparently in the case of the Jews of Loango, or as they did in the case of the black Jews of Cochin in Kerala, or as they apparently did in the case of the Bnei Israel of Bombay in Western India, or as it apparently did in the case of Jews who were living at the time in the Sahara, or as it appeared to be with Jewish communities who, according to travelers, were at the time living in the Jordan Valley, about whom I sadly know not nearly as much as I would like to know, and various other groups. All of these kind of black Jewish groups, brown, they were all kind of dragooned as part of the holy crusade of proving the unified origins of mankind. What a noble thing that turned out to be. And of course, with Darwin, that pretty much marks the end of polygenism, except that even today there are genetic scientists who fiddle around with the proof in such a way that it looks as if there are races and that they're kind of significantly different from each other, but it really is not the case. And the Nazis, of course, were deeply, deeply, deeply wedded to the polygynist paradigm, and particularly the idea that races could not change. So the Jews, they constructed as being a sort of mishmash, almost an unrace, but deeply dangerous to the racial purity of the Reich, but unchanging. They'd been unchanged and unchanging for thousands of years, as indeed had the Aryans and other racial groupings.
So should we go to the question about conflation? What does conflation mean? Were there different kinds of conflation of Jews and blacks over time? Or should we go to the question of looking at your slides?
Well, let me quickly just deal, because the conflation is in the title of my book. And I think just to say what I mean by it would be a good introduction really to the slides. And Bonnie sort of mentioned very kindly a chapter in that 2013 book. And there was nothing original about that. There's a great scholar by the name of Sander Gilman, who really is the father of all studies about the perceptions of the body of the Jew. He's an extraordinary scholar, and I owe a huge amount to everything that he's written, and I admire him enormously. And so a long time ago, he wrote that there was a kind of medieval perception that Jews were black, and there's plenty of proof that within Europe, the Jews were considered to be kind of black. There are many images of Jews being black, and even if they weren't black, they were not even slightly black, they were kind of considered to be black in one way or another. So blackness and Jews really went hand in hand. If you read his work, or if you read my work, and particularly if you read this new book, you will see the multitude of examples of it. And if you go, for instance, into the marginalia, the illustrations in English or European prayer books in the 13th and 14th centuries, you frequently see hook-nosed Jews wearing Jewish hats and with black faces. So the idea that Jews were black was definitely there, before the Enlightenment period. And
so let's go to the slides now.
Just a sec, because I just need to say, too, in the 19th century, the idea of Jewish blackness was reinforced by the discovery of all of these actual black Jews in India and Africa, all over the place. And by 1850, the main racial theorists of the day started saying that, yes, actually, Jews are Negroes. Negroes in some way are also Jews. This is the conflation. It's partly political, it's partly metaphorical, and it's very, very significantly biological. I'm ready to go to the slides if you think
Okay.
it's a good moment.
No, it's like picturing the Jews as chameleons of some sort, right? They're like pick up the identity of the place where they live or something.
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly part of 20th century anti-Semitic discourses that they take on the colorings of wherever they are, and you can never tell a Jew. And you know, one of the great problems the Nazis had was that, according to Nazi theory, you could tell a Jew by looking at him. You know, a Jew is obvious, he's physically obvious, he's black for a start, and he's got a Jewish face, he's got a Jewish body, he's got Jewish ears, he's got Jewish hair, he's got Jewish everything. Except when it comes to it, you couldn't actually tell the difference between a Gentile and a Jew in the area of the Third Reich. And all of the thousands, tens of thousands of studies that were done measuring noses and measuring ears and measuring, you know, forehead slant, all of the kinds of things that they were doing in the first half of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, they proved to come up with a single thing that would help in the identification of Jews. So at a time when the Nazis desperately needed to be able to identify Jews so they could murder them, they didn't actually have any way of doing it physically. They had to rely upon documents, and they had to rely upon spies, and they had to rely upon the concierge at the bottom of the stairs who said, "Ah, Monsieur Cohen, il est en bas." Oh, you know, that sort of thing. But when it came to taking somebody and looking at them in the face and saying, yes, that guy is Jewish and we can prove it because of X, Y, and Z, they couldn't do it at all. And they desperately tried to do it throughout the period of the Third Reich. And so all kinds of studies were done to try and prove that the ears or the nose or whatever it might be, blood types was a favorite for a while until it was shown that there were no blood types that were unique to Jews at all, etc., etc.
Okay, let's go to the slides now.
So this is just the slide which we don't really need now. This is just showing where Loango is, and you know, after the initial mention in 1777 of the Jews, black Jews of Loango, there was a German expedition exactly 100 years later to the area of Loango coast, and there are three big fat German tomes that emerged from this scientific visit, and there we have a lot more information about them. Sadly, very little is known, if anything, about their cultural or religious practices, but we do know that they were there. They were exactly where the slave back in the 1770s had said that they were. They had a specific culture. They were relatively well off. They were traders, etc., etc. So actually a very, very interesting community. And what is deeply fascinating is that, as my dear friend Nathan de Vere, who is the greatest of scholars on the subject of the Jews of Africa, a wonderful, wonderful scholar, and you should certainly be looking him up and buying his books. He's a great, great man. He's traveled everywhere and he's fearless. So he's told me about Judaizing movements in and around the area of the Jewish community of Loango in the present day. And it would be really interesting to see if there's any connection. But the latest piece of information I have about the community is something coming from the 1950s or early 1960s, which suggests that they moved inland towards the end of the 19th century, probably, and they went to the edge of the rain forest, a little to the north of the purple mauve area of Luango here, and intermarried with pygmies in the area of the, as I said, of the rainforest. You know, if there's any connection between them and Judaizing manifestations today, I'd be really interested. I don't know if there are, but future scholars will be able to tell us perhaps in due course. But it would be very interesting to do a DNA study on that group if they're still there. So that's that slide. So this is one of the kind of interesting depictions. This is Caiaphas appearing, Jesus appearing before the high priest Caiaphas, and then the people in the back are Jews. As you can see, they're black and they've got hooked noses, and they're looking a bit sinister. And these kind of stereotypical Jewish faces are totally you know, usual, if you like, in the illustrations to be found in prayer books in England. And there are a couple of wonderful books written by scholars. One, Kaplan, fabulous book, which is looking particularly at the way in which Jews are represented in medieval texts. Pictorial texts, or rather illustrated texts. And here's another one. It's a beautiful thing, which would have been part of the robes of an important priest, probably a bishop or something. And it's embroidered. And it's, if you're interested, next time you're in the V&A in London, you can try and go and see it. And what you see is Jesus carrying the cross, and what we have is a black person beating him. And given that there are no Africans mentioned in the Old Testament, at least with respect to the period of Jesus, nothing in this period. The assumption is that this may be a black Jew, and that would be consistent with the images that I've already mentioned. So one of the interesting things is the question of the face. And in the 18th century, a new science of physiognomy was formed. And through the face, initially, the idea was that you can, if you really understand the face, and if you understand the science of the face, the real science of the face, then you'll be able to choose a husband or a wife suitably. You can choose a servant. You can select a doctor who's going to be helpful and honest. And going through life, as long as you understand the face, you'll be okay. You can select people according to your understanding of what the face is telling you. And this is a big deal for 100 years at least. And nobody would really take it very seriously now, although there are new movements using computerized images and DNA and stuff, which are looking at physiognomy afresh. But this was taken up by race theorists. And so the idea came that every race has got its own face, and that face is absolutely unchangeable. And so time and time again, you know, Jews and blacks, black Africans is what I mean by that, were brought together because of one signal feature, which is that they both had an unchanging face. You can always tell them, you can go back through history and you can see this unchanging African Jewish face. It wasn't applied to other people, and it was applied to these two groups. And I didn't say before, but I should have done, was that through all of the kind of medieval literature, which is beginning to interest itself in the possibilities of races. I mean, this is really before the beginning of the racial age, as I would understand it. You know, there are two groups that are considered to be completely unique in the history of the world. One are Negroes, as they called them at the time, and one were Jews. So it's blacks and Jews who were the outliers as far as European thought went. And so this image of Memnon in the British museums was very much discussed at the time because it appeared to everybody to incorporate the classical Jewish face. And race theorists went to the places in the East End of London where there were a lot of Jews, and they would come back absolutely flabbergasted that wherever they went, they saw time and time and time again an identical face to that of this Egyptian Memnon. So the next one. So as I said, by the time we get to the period of the Third Reich, there is an absolute conflation of the idea of the Jew and the idea of the black. Both Jews and sub-Saharan Africans were considered to be mortally perilous as far as the racial health of the Third Reich was concerned. And in this image, which has got to do with, you know, the shame of disgrace of race. I mean, the idea of, you know, the idea that German women were fatally attracted to Jews and to blacks is represented in this image and in countless other images. So you have the conflation of the two ideas, and that conflation passes into a whole range of different kinds of discourses, which essentially say what so many people in the medieval period had said, which is that Jews were essentially black. And if we have time, I could just mention briefly, because it's fascinating. As you know, there's no unified Germany until 1871. But once there's a united German Reich, it becomes important for the Germans to assess that this new nation, to assess what kind of nation it was in the racial terms that were popular at the time. And so they decided to mount an experiment. And it was an experiment which took in millions and millions and millions of children throughout Germany, which included, of course, Jewish children who were given a separate category. But basically what happened was that teachers were given the responsibility of marking down things like eye color, hair color, skin color, and so on. And they were given a method of assessing on the basis of eye color and hair color what the skin color really was. But it wasn't the actual skin color that you could see that was the skin color that had to be marked onto the sheet that was given to the teachers to fill in. It was the skin under the sleeve. It was the skin under the sleeve. It was the naked skin. And so if you look at the naked skin, you could see what the real color was. And so it was embedded in the ideas of all of these millions of children in the 1870s who grew to adulthood, you know, by the turn of the century, that visible skin color can be very deceptive, and the real skin color is somehow something to be determined, something that is, so to speak, under the sleeve. And this becomes incredibly important during the Nazi period in a very curious way, because it's a sad thing to have to say, but an enormous amount of Nazi racial theory was and legal practice was borrowed from the United States of America, which has always been really a hotbed of the most violent racism. And indeed, it's very, very easy to show. It's actually incredible. People haven't made a bigger deal of it. But if you take somebody like the founder of the person who's responsible for the term anti-Semitism, and this is in the second half of the 19th century, one of the first political anti-Semite. He became an anti-Semite. He became an anti-Semite as a result of going to the Americas and seeing the way that black people were discriminated against, both in the United States. Also, he went to Nicaragua, interestingly, where slavery was practiced even later than here in the US. So you can see that, you know, the hatred of black people impacted mightily upon the period of the 19th century that led into the racial ideas of the Nazis. And even during that period, they were totally viewed as one thing. Hitler himself said that, talking about the United States, he said it's half nigger, it's half Jew, half Negro, half Jew. And he would have used the N-word, I'm sure, had he been speaking in English. And forgive me for using it, but it seemed appropriate in that particular context. And in another context, Hitler himself said that yes, Jews are Negro. Jews are Negroes. Full stop. They were thought to be Negroes. Full stop. That is conflation. Next slide. So this shows that the ideas of the Nazis really were not unique to Germany. They also spread to fascist Italy. This is a really interesting fascist racial journal. And here you can see somebody who's supposed to be a Jew on the right-hand side, and he's being aided and abetted by a black African on his right. And here you have a picture of an unblemished Italian maiden, and they're in an act of joint seduction. So the idea that the racial purity of the Italians was something that was being threatened by the Jews and by the blacks was something that was graphically portrayed here. And in a way, if you look very carefully at the image, you can see that coming out of the head of the African, there are horns, and there is certainly a kind of suggestion here that, of course, the Jews had, in medieval times, had been thought to have horns, and we all know about the way in which Moses was often represented as having horns as a result of a misunderstanding of a biblical passage. But the idea that you know, the Jews were diabolical and they had horns like the devil, etc., and that, you know, the goat was the animal of the Jews. All of this is well known and has been well studied. And here we have a sense that you have a Jew, but you also have a black who, in a sense, is also a Jew, threatening the purity of this Italian, this virtuous Italian girl. Next slide. And this says it even, well, it says the same thing. Here you have an image of Italian purity represented by a classical statue. And on it you have the fingerprint, a black fingerprint, suggesting the taint of black blood. And in the middle of that, you have a Star of David, saying exactly the same thing. The threat to the purity of the Italian race is coming from the same source. It's black, and it's Jewish. Conflation. So the idea of racial contamination extended to the field of music, and of course to the field of art. The word here, entartete Musik, is decadent music. Decadent art was the other thing, and anything Jewish or anything arising from black culture, wherever it was, whether it was African, whether it was African American, was eventually banned. But this is intriguing because this does represent the idea, which is in fact not false, that the jazz and the music of the 1920s, music of jazz and swing, etc., was a joint enterprise of Jews and blacks, and it comes out of a sense among Jews and undoubtedly among blacks at the time as well, that the fate of Jews and the fate of blacks were somehow intertwined, and that they had a huge amount in common. And I think that the Jewish involvement in jazz particularly was an expression of that. Next slide. No slide.
Okay, I think that kind of finishes the slides. I just saw a documentary on Louis Armstrong, who and he was wearing a Jewish star because of all of his patrons were Jewish, and throughout his life he wore this Jewish star. So so we discussed how these ideas feed into the nightmare of the Holocaust. So let's get to today. What are the implications for race relations today? We have like another 5 minutes to do this in UK, US, and Israel, or choose one of them if you just want to pick one. Did you hear me?
I didn't hear what the question was.
Oh, I'm sorry. What are the implications for race today in the UK, US, and Israel? There's only a few minutes left for this part of the discussion. You can pick one or mention all three, or
well, I haven't got much time to develop anything in the current context, other than the fact that the situation in Europe and the situation here is quite different in one very important respect, that it would seem here that the mythology of race still really guides a whole range of discussions, and it really, really should not. It is well known. It is well known to educated people. I would say, particularly in academia, perhaps, but generally, that there is no such thing as race. There are no biological differences between peoples. There are differences between individuals, but there are no biological differences between groups of people. So to talk about race is a complete nonsense. And we've been saying this now for the last 70 years, since after the Holocaust. That really should have rammed the last nail into the coffin of even using the word race. You know, we're reluctant, we mustn't, and we don't use the N-word. We shouldn't be using the R word because it's meaningless, and it offends me mightily that I have to fill in forms in America where I have to talk about my race. What are you talking about? What are you saying? What's it mean? Why does it matter? You know, so that's one of the things. If you use the word race, Rasse or Rasse in Germany, and people look at you and think, why are you talking? Where are you? You know, where's your? So, you know, that's one of the things. I think if discussions weren't as racialized, it would be far better for everybody. Now, the question of color, again, is it's so meaningless. It really is so meaningless. Why refer to people as white? People aren't white, they're pink or they're yellow. There's no white person on the face of the globe. One of the examples I gave when I was speaking to Bonnie yesterday was that, you know, if you take probably the whitest people, probably Finns living near the you know, the very northernmost point of Finland, are probably as white as anybody. And, you know, if you compare them to the blackest people in the world, who, by the way, are not Africans, they're people living in New Britain, just off the coast of Papua New Guinea, what would you find? Are there any significant differences in terms of DNA? No, there aren't. There absolutely, you know, the number of genes that are responsible for skin color are so few that it's a completely meaningless thing. You would find that they have absolutely everything in common. There's hardly any difference at all between these two groups. So, you know, why are we talking about it? Why are we talking about skin color? We're talking about skin color because of prejudice, and the prejudice can only be rooted out when people understand that there are no races, there are no differences, there are no differences of potential intelligence, there are no differences in capacity, there are no differences in biological makeup. So that's what I would say. Now, I think, you know, to end on a positive note, I suggested earlier that the racial age started at the end of the 17th century with the work of François Bernier. It developed through the 18th and 19th century. It reached its horrific and horrible crescendo during the period of transatlantic slavery and of course, the Holocaust. And then you would think it had kind of come to an end, but it hasn't. But I think myself that it's almost over. I don't think that, you know, in 20, 30 or 40 years from now, we'll be talking much about race, because thank God, it's, I think it's a generational obsession. Younger people throughout the West anyway, think much less in racial terms than people of my generation certainly did. You know, I'd be the first to admit that growing up in Great Britain in the 1940s, when we still had the biggest empire that the world had ever seen. I was born in 1944, so this was true until you know, for the first few years of my life. We were taught to believe that we were racially superior to any group on earth. That's how we were raised. That's how we were educated, and it is. You don't get rid of it. It's something that you have to struggle against. But it's going to be very much easier, I think, for the younger generation, my son's generation. I've got one son who's 50, I've got one son who's 20, and the 20-year-old doesn't really get it. You know, there's so many people of different backgrounds in the school he went to that he doesn't really feel it. So I think there are glimmers of hope. In America at the moment, the whole thing is devastating, and it's very largely the result of this awful pandemic. I think that the discussion of the pandemic, unfortunately, has been racialized to an incredible extent. People don't understand when they read that African Americans are suffering more than any other group, and they think, oh, well, they must be more susceptible to it. they do not understand that it's not a question of physical susceptibility or anything of that sort. It's a question of poverty. So the way that African Americans are suffering this ghastly plague is going to be similar to the way in which other disadvantaged and poor people are suffering it. It doesn't need to be racialized at all.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I know that everybody who listened to this really have moved a degree or two in their understanding of of the race issue historically, during the Holocaust, and today. So before we asked people to send in questions. As I said before, I had eye surgery, retina surgery, so I can't read small print, but some of the questions were given to us before this event, and I'm going to start with these questions, and then if we have time, I will turn it over to Harriet again and break into small groups, and where we can either get to know each other or speak about what they learned in your group. And then we ask you to come back and stay and chat with us and whoever wants to chat with you. So the first question I received, and this is in no particular order, and it's not necessarily related to stuff that you talked about. Have the Board of Rabbis of South Africa recognized the claim of the Lemba to be descendant from ancient Israelites?
Not that I know of. I don't believe they have. And I don't really have anything to say about that because, you know, I mean, I think on the one hand, the, you know, sort of reform liberal wing of the of South African Jewry has been very open to the community over time, and they've certainly held out a hand of friendship. In my own research, but I haven't worked on the Lemba for quite a number of years now, particularly. I mean, I follow the, you know, the story with great interest. But the Orthodox synagogue has not been particularly interested, as far as I know. And, but I'd rather not say any more about that.
Okay. What is your view? I don't know if you've read it or know the book, but this is the question. What is your view of the book White Fragility?
Well, I haven't read the book. In fact, I've seen reviews of it, and I think I've already sort of expressed a view which may be relevant to the book, which is that we need to change the paradigm. We need to stop thinking in racial terms.
How do you analyze the existence of anti-Semitism against Black Jews?
Well, I think that, you know, anti-Semitism is a very complex phenomenon, obviously, and as soon as Black Jews declare themselves as Jews, then they run the risk of being identified as being Zionists. And so I know, for instance, that in South Africa, the Lemba got into some trouble because of a perceived association with Zionism, which was not considered to be a good thing, and that may have led to some prejudice against them. Yeah, you know, I mean, Africa is it's a far more religious continent than Europe and even than the United States. And most of it is Christian. And the number of Christians in Africa is growing. The other main religion in Africa is Islam. So both for Islam and for Christianity, being Jewish is not probably such a great deal. You know, on the one hand, you're the principal enemy of the Prophet Muhammad at the beginning of his ministry, during his conquest of Medina, Yathrib. And on the other hand, you're perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being partially responsible for the death of Christ. So, you know, it's fairly obvious that as soon as anybody decides to identify with Jews, there'll be certain benefits, but there will also be a downside.
So this is the question, and I think I'll reframe it just a little bit. What is the theory and theology behind the matrilineal-patrilineal divide in African Judaism? And I think that has to do with some of the groups who say they want to convert and some of the groups who say they don't want to convert. And maybe you can make some comments on that general picture.
Well, I think it's a really excellent question, a really good question. And I don't really know that, you know, I've never done a particular study on it. All I can say is that in the context of what I do know, which is quite a lot about the traditions of the Lemba, the Waremba in southern Africa. You know, the whole thing, the whole business was male, and you know, it was possible for any woman can become a member of the Lemba tribe, but no man can. So it was, and also the traditions of the Lemba were passed down not by the women, by the men. And you can see that, you know, if we think about our own homes and our own lives and backgrounds, the extent to which women are totally responsible for the passing on of family traditions from one generation to the next in all kinds of ways, not least food and stories. Exactly the opposite is true of let's say the Lemba, but I believe also of other communities. So you know, obviously in a group which is patrilineal, in fact, over many centuries, once they have to articulate themselves in a mainstream Jewish framework, they will want to maintain their own patrilineal sense of the world.
Okay, I think that we're really running late and we started late. So let's, Harriet, would you like to say a few words? And then we will break into some groups to chat a little bit. And Professor Parfitt, when we gather again, I will have somebody read you some of the questions that came in the chat. Okay, Harriet?
Hello.
Harriet, okay, good.
I'm coming. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Bonnie and to Professor Parfitt. One of the things Kulanu is most proud of is the friends that we have worked with and attracted, the people who volunteer their time and give us advice and help. And Professor Tudor Parfitt has been one of our wonderful friends, as are so many of you in the community today. I know I see all kinds of people here who have been at our side and providing advice and help and information and contacts and travel as we work together. But in particular, we want to thank Professor Parfitt today. Before we say goodbye, I want to take the time to personally thank all of you who have supported Kulanu over the years. Your donations and volunteer help have meant so much to all of our Kulanu communities. And again, we have a number of people from those communities with us today. In these challenging times when we can't be sure what turns the economy will take, your support is needed now more than ever. Each community has immediate needs, and some of these needs are of an emergency nature. We thank you in advance for whatever you can do to ease these financial burdens. We appreciate each donor to Kulanu, whether you are able to donate $18 or $10,000. In each case, we hope you'll dig deep in your pocket to support this work. Please go to kulanu.org/donate. I'm sure Molly will put that in the chat, either to donate online or to learn how to donate by mail. The secure link is in the chat. Many thanks to all of you. If you need to leave now, thanks for joining us. If you could stay, we will now be breaking into breakout groups to visit with each other